What made Richard Marquand an unusual choice for a Star Wars film was not that he was a bad director. On the contrary, he was an award-winning director for some of his television work. What made him an unusual choice was that Star Wars 3 was a film with a budget of more than $30 million, a massive undertaking that Lucas knew from both personal experience as a director and from the logistical issues during Empire could easily overwhelm you. Marquand knew how to direct and was good with working with actors, and was still small enough that he would be willing to acquiesce to Lucas on things. On paper, he was an ideal choice for Lucas to have his cake and eat it too, to have control without needing to be on set. But what works in the lab doesn't always work in the real world. Marquand was committed to the project. He was a personal fan of the original film, though he was highly critical of Empire. And being from the UK, knew a lot of the people who could work as both cast and crew on the film. But this was such a huge project that he was suddenly dealing with things far outside of his area of expertise. During location scouting for the Sarlacc pit, Marquand admitted that he said nothing because he had no experience and didn't want to say something stupid. During pre-production, he wouldn't show up until early afternoon because he didn't understand the logistics of these complicated sets, or the elaborate monster suits or practical effects. At one point, he realized he had woefully underestimated the size of the set and was only saved because Norman Reynolds recognized it and had built extra pieces in anticipation of the problem. It happened because Marquand was terrified of going over budget or over schedule because so much criticism had been made of Empire in the Lucasfilm halls, and while he was enthusiastic, he was clearly in over his head. Costumes? That he knew. Connection with his cast? That he knew. Developing a rapport with his crew? That he knew. Making a big-budget special effects-filled war picture in outer space? That was pretty damn far from a documentary about the Beatles. So, while Lucas had planned to pull back from direct involvement on Return of the Jedi and allow the structure that he had built to run things without him, the reality was that Marquand needed him on set if this was going to get done. He flat out told Lucas that he wanted him on set to ensure that everything was done right. Lucas could see that he was right, and that his plan had blown up in his face. Instead of needing to be less involved, he was even more involved than on Empire, which was a problem for everyone involved. At one point, Marquand told Carrie Fisher that she should stand like a sentry. Then Lucas came in and told Carrie Fisher to stop standing like a sentry. With directions like that, it was no wonder everyone was confused as to who was in charge. Lucas recalled how frustrated he was trying to edit Empire, and so demanded Marquand use far more cameras in order to give Lucas options in editing as opposed to Marquand crafting his vision of how it should look. A few times he would pull rank on Lucas in front of the crew, saying that he was the director and it was his call. But everyone knew this was just a face-saving gesture, and impossible not to note the irony of Marquand directing scenes full of puppets while Lucas was literally behind him and calling the shots. Even in a recent interview, when Kazanjian was asked point-blank if Lucas ghost-directed Jedi, he ducked the question. Also, remember that a lot of these people have worked on the other two films as well, and comparisons were made to Kershner, and they were not flattering. That while Kershner had breezed through with his confidence, Marquand was clearly terrified of what he'd signed up for. He'd hoped that Lucas's presence would be a reassurance. Instead, it made Lucas feel that Marquand needed supervision. This not only increased Lucas's workload by an order of magnitude, but it meant what was supposed to be a week-long visit to get things set up turned into a permanent stay. Marcia would have to further step up her involvement with Lucasfilm matters back in California while he stayed in London. It would especially involve overseeing work on the now-under-construction Skywalker Ranch. This would also substantially inflate the costs of the film, because Lucas was supposed to be working with ILM during this period. They worked on other areas during that time, but it put the effects weeks behind schedule. Things were also complicated because a terrible cold was going around the UK at this time. Anthony Daniels had his mask filled with mucus because he couldn't blow his nose between takes. Carrie Fisher was diagnosed with bronchitis. George Lucas took a weekend in Paris to try to relax and spent the entire time in his hotel room looking like death warmed over. And the actor originally slated to play the Emperor was too sick to continue. so Ian McDiarmid, who had been a strong contender for the role, was called back. He was an unexpected choice given his relative youth, but this was actually seen as an asset, that he would be better capable of handling the heavy makeup that this role demanded.
Oh, I'm afraid the deflector shield will be quite operational when your friends arrive.
Carrie Fisher was in a frustrating position when it came to both their new director, whom she felt treated her and Mark Hamill badly, and to the character of Leia. Marquand detested the character's portrayal in Empire and altered it to the point that Fisher had no idea how to play her anymore. In the first film, she had defiantly stood up to Tarkin and Darth Vader. In the second, she could go toe-to-toe verbally with the presence of Han Solo. In the third, all that was taken away. She had no lines when made a prisoner of Jabba. Her lines in the rebel briefing were given to Mon Mothma, and the revelation of who her true family was required an emotional response that was inconsistent with what had been previously established. The rough-and-tumble princess and freedom fighter was made to conform to a more regressive image of femininity, that she should be meek and emotionally vulnerable rather than strong and nuanced.
Where's Leia?
I'm here.
When given the choice, Fisher insisted on strangling Jabba herself rather than the stunt woman to get a bit of satisfaction out of that, work out a little of her frustrations. But the animosity finally led to a breakdown when Fisher had to do some complicated action scene, and she was having trouble hitting her marks and doing her acting at the same time, and Marquand finally delivered an F-bomb criticism of her performance. After the strain of the shoot, she just lost it and broke down crying, setting everything back for over half an hour. The two seemed to do their best to stay out of each other's way for the rest of the shoot. Harrison Ford was also dissatisfied with the way the film was going. He repeatedly asked that Han Solo be killed off, that dying in service of this greater cause was the natural end for his character. Kasdan had been pushing for something like that throughout the story meetings as well, but Lucas put his foot down. He wanted his happy ending. He even went so far as to say that he regretted killing Ben back in the original film for the same reason that Kasdan was suggesting it here, to prove that the situation is serious. Ford remarked that the reason was really because there was no future in dead Han Solo action figures. A cynical answer, perhaps, but one that seemed to be mirrored by others who were in or had departed from the company, that the merchandise had become so lucrative that it was now a factor in the making of the films. The accusation wasn't exactly refuted when the actor playing General Maydean arrived and was quickly told that he would have to wear a beard because the Maydean toy had one. Instead of the toy being modeled after the actor, now the actors were being modeled after the toys. Shooting the film was an elaborate affair. While Empire had location shooting limited in Norway and then the rest was done in the London studios, Jedi upped the ante. First, there was the grueling shoot in London, where often intense lighting to mimic the suns of the desert was used so that the temperature, high at the best of times on a film set, was intolerable for the crew that was dressed in street clothes. The people under latex masks were constantly passing out from it. And then there was the problem with the set for the mission briefing, which Lucas wanted to look as sophisticated and advanced as possible, to show this was the rebellion at its strongest. Only pigeons had taken to nesting over it, and as Anthony Daniels noted, it's a bit difficult to appreciate the technical sophistication of a computer that's been covered in pigeon crap. A return to the Dagobah Swamp set that no one was anxious to revisit, complete with a malfunctioning Yoda puppet, was in there, along with the Sandstorm sequence that was a royal pain and never made the final cut anyway. And problems with the Death Star hangar, whose floor kept being destroyed by even the most minimal walking on it, until they applied a coating that now made it impossible for the actors to walk across it without falling over. By the time the studio shooting was all finished, Marquand said it was horrifying to realize they still had weeks to go to finish with location shooting in America. The original film had its location shooting mostly limited to Tunisia, with a bit of work back in America for what they couldn't finish in time, and some second unit work down in Central America for Yavin 4. But this was far more elaborate than that. The desert was in Arizona this time, an area marked off 400 feet square, patrolled to keep out snoops and local troublemakers who were annoyed at this intrusion into their desert. The vegetation had to be removed in order to make it look like Tatooine. Not to worry, they put it all back when they were finished. But it was a problem because that stuff sheltered the local wildlife, which included venomous snakes that were now looking for places to go and, well, posed a serious risk to anyone who was on set. An irony considering how many were present during the filming of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Why did it have to be snakes? Jabba's sail barge was constructed on location, a hefty $2.5 million prop. So huge and expensive was it that the interior, rather than being a hive of scum and villainy, was facilities for cast and crew, including offices and a commissary. The special effects crew wanted to blow it up when they were all finished, but they would have to settle for having it done at ILM. In addition, Endor was set in a redwood forest near Crescent City, California. Always looking to push the envelope, after having the space battle of the Death Star in the first film and the epic invasion of Hoth in the second, now Lucas wanted to have a high-speed chase through the woods. This again required ILM to devise new techniques, helped along by the use of video to determine how the shots should look in the final product.
Forget the gun. Catch up with him. Pull next to that guy.
A combination of blue screen at ILM and some slower recording with a Steadicam gave an impression of speedy maneuvers around the trees. For the collisions, ILM went with the Wile E. Coyote approach of building breakaway bikes with a dummy on the back and just firing them at high speed into the trees. The forest shooting would also require the attack on the bunker, as well as numerous Ewok scenes. Carrie Fisher had recently starred in the dud Chevy Chase film Under the Rainbow, a film based in part upon rumors that, during the Wizard of Oz filmmaking, that the little people playing the Munchkins threw some out-of-control parties. While the film was a dud, it had led to concerns that this huge troupe of actors playing Ewoks might wind up pulling the same thing here. There was word that things had gotten somewhat rowdy in England, so this wasn't an out-of-nowhere concern. So to avoid getting thrown out of the sleepy little town by out-of-control partying Ewoks, they were put in a hotel over the border, a move that, in the end, everyone pretty much regretted, because not only did the actors cause no problems, but there were actual problems trying to get them to the set from where their hotel was. This was, sadly, not the first time special arrangements had been required in Star Wars history when it came to the shorter members of its cast. On location in Tunisia, Kenny Baker and Jack Purvis had to have someone assigned to be with them at all times. Not because they were causing trouble, it was because of the locals. They were convinced that the two men had been placed under some terrible curse and would spit on them and other things that sound like they happened in a 16th century village. For this film, Baker had been given a chance to do something outside of R2-D2, an Ewok that would come across Princess Leia once she was separated from the group. Well, proving that perhaps he was indeed cursed, Baker wasn't able to play the character. He got food poisoning, so the role was given to the young Warwick Davis. Baker wasn't the only one replaced. Anthony Daniels had been dismissed early because his part wasn't needed, only for them to realize, he is needed, and he was out of contact. They had to draft a hasty replacement, and the only person they could find that could fit the costume was a local logger, who was confused but grateful for the money. In fact, many out-of-work loggers soon found themselves being employed, frequently as stormtroopers who suddenly found themselves being attacked by an army of teddy bears. The situation with the locals was better than in the desert, but it had its own complexities. See, there were a number of Bigfoot sightings in the area, and it was feared that someone might wander too close to the set and shoot Peter Mayhew when he was in costume as Chewbacca. Thankfully, no one was shot, smashed, or cursed, and they were able to move on to editing the film. Mark Wend had wanted Sean Barton to be his editor, but upon viewing the submitted director's cut, Lucas was prepared to fire Barton. He was that unhappy with it. It was only when he saw some of the edits that Barton had put together for Ben Burt for his alien languages scenes that he realized Barton wasn't the problem here. It seemed that Lucas's gambit had failed. Mark Wand was a fine filmmaker, but he was totally wrong for this kind of film, and for achieving what Lucas wanted. He wanted a director as talented as Kirshner had been, but more malleable, and instead wound up with someone who required more work than if Lucas had just done it himself in the first place. One of the reasons post-production would prove a nightmare was that Lucas was remaking Marquand's movie into his own movie, because the film he shot and the film Lucas wanted just weren't the same, straining the staff close to the breaking point and contributing to the rise in expense. All problems that likely would not have happened if Lucas hadn't been forced to drop Steven Spielberg, whose work on Raiders had been great for Lucas, and whose film that had come out during Jedi's production, E.T., surpassed even the original Star Wars at the box office. Indeed, it could be argued that by not putting an Irvin Kershner film at the front of The Empire Strikes Back, Lucas had unwittingly damaged Star Wars, Lucasfilm, and his own life.